His wife mocked him in front of her entire family for being broke, and the whole time there was a check for $4.7 million sitting in his jacket pocket. Not a promise, not a maybe, a check made out to him, signed, dated, and ready to deposit. While his wife smiled at another man across her father's Thanksgiving table and told everyone within earshot that her husband hadn't brought in a dime in 8 months. She said it like he wasn't sitting right there. She said it like it was nothing. Like he was nothing. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the quiet man they'd been laughing at for 7 years had been holding something that would unravel every single one of them. Not just his wife, her father, his empire, his investors, all of it. Built, without any of them realizing it, on something that belonged to the man they couldn't stop dismissing. And he waited. He let them laugh. Then he made one phone call. If you have ever been underestimated by the one person who was supposed to believe in you, this story is for you. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because we drop stories like this every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. And if this one already has you locked in, go ahead and drop a like. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells me to keep going. Most importantly, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this all started, to a Thanksgiving dinner in Charlotte, North Carolina, where a man carried a secret into a house that had never once made him feel welcome. Nate Greer pulled into the Beaumont driveway at 2:30, a ceramic dish of his grandmother's sweet potato casserole, wrapped in foil and sitting warm on the passenger seat beside him. He had been up since 6 that morning making it. Nobody met him at the door. He let himself in the way he always did, quietly, through the side entrance off the garage, past the coat closet that smelled like cedar and dry cleaning bags. The house was already full. He could hear Bernard's voice carrying from the dining room, deep and ceremonial, the way it always got when he had an audience worth performing for. He could hear laughter. He could hear Portia's laugh, specifically, bright and practiced, the one she used when she wanted people to notice her enjoying herself. Nate set the casserole down on the kitchen counter. A woman he didn't recognize, hired for the occasion by the look of her uniform, glanced at the dish and slid it to the far end of the counter without a word. He straightened his jacket and walked into the dining room. The table was already arranged. 12 place settings, white linen, the good china that Gloria only brought out twice a year. Portia stood near the far end, her hand resting on the back of a chair. Not Nate's chair. The man sitting in that chair was tall, wore a charcoal blazer that fit like it had been measured that morning, and had the kind of easy, expensive smile that filled rooms without trying. Holden Price. Portia had mentioned him twice in the past month. Old friend, she'd said both times. Nate hadn't asked follow-up questions. Portia looked up when Nate walked in. Something passed across her face. Not warmth, not quite. More like the brief recalibration of someone adjusting a seating chart in their head. "There's a spot near the kitchen end," she said, and turned back to Holden. Nate found the chair she meant. It sat between a distant cousin of Gloria's whose name he could never remember, and an empty seat that remained empty for the entire meal. Bernard called everyone to the table at 3 o'clock sharp. He stood at the head with a glass of Bordeaux and the posture of a man who had never once doubted his own importance. His toast was long. It touched on gratitude, on legacy, on the meaning of family. It lingered, with unmistakable intention, on the word builders. "To the builders at this table," Bernard said, raising his glass, to the men and women who make things happen, who create, who provide. His eyes swept the room. They did not stop at Nate. The table drank. Portia drank. Holden drank with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly where he stood in that room and had no complaints about it. The food came out, prime rib, macaroni and cheese, still crackling from the oven, collard greens with smoked turkey. Someone had made sweet potato casserole too, a store-bought version that appeared in a glass dish near the center of the table. Nate's dish was not brought out. He ate what was in front of him and said very little. It was Portia who said it. She wasn't even looking at Nate when she did it. She was laughing at something Holden had just said, and then the laughter softened into something more conversational, and then she said it the way people say things they've been holding for a while and have finally found the right room to release them in. I mean, at this point I'm basically running our household solo. She said it lightly, like a fact and not a blade. Nate hasn't brought in anything in close to 8 months. I don't even bring it up anymore. What's the point? The table didn't erupt. It was worse than that. It rippled. A few quiet laughs, a couple of glances, the particular discomfort of people who found something funny and were trying to decide if they were allowed to show it. Bernard said nothing. He just cut his prime rib with the patience of a man who had heard nothing surprising. Gloria reached for the bread basket and said, without quite looking up, "Some men provide and some men just putter." 2 people at the table laughed outright this time. Nate set his fork down. He pressed his napkin to his mouth once, folded it, and placed it beside his plate. "Excuse me a second," he said. No one responded. He walked to the coat closet near the entryway, took his jacket from the hanger, and held it for a moment. His right hand found the pocket. He didn't reach inside. He just let his fingers rest there against the fabric, feeling the shape of the envelope beneath. It was still there. He hung the jacket back up, smoothed the front of it once, and returned to the table. Holden was talking about a deal he'd closed in October. $9 million, logistics sector, 14 months of negotiations. He described it the way men like Holden described things, casually, generously, as though he were giving the room a gift just by sharing it. Portia squeezed his arm. Nate picked his fork back up and finished eating. By the time dessert came out, the conversation had moved on entirely. Nate wasn't in it. He answered the one question directed at him. Something about traffic on the way over. And then the table moved past him again like a current around a stone. When the chairs finally scraped back and people drifted toward the living room, Nate stood slowly. He walked to the coat closet one more time. He took his jacket from the hanger and draped it over his arm. His fingers brushed the pocket again, just briefly. Then he followed the rest of them into the living room, sat down in a chair near the window and waited for the evening to be over. He was very good at waiting. To understand what happened at that Thanksgiving table, you have to go back to the beginning. Nate and Portia met in the fall of 2016 at a logistics conference in downtown Charlotte. They were both mid-level at the time, Nate a supply chain coordinator at a regional freight company, Portia a junior analyst climbing fast at a commercial bank. She was sharp and focused and laughed at his jokes before he finished them. He thought that meant something. For a while, it did. The Beaumont family made their position clear from the first dinner. Bernard had looked Nate up and down at the door that night, really looked the way a man does when he's already made a decision and is just confirming it, and said, loud enough for the room, "So you're the young man from the freight company?" Not a question, a categorization. Gloria had smiled her careful smile and handed Nate a sweet tea like she was tipping the help. Portia had laughed it off on the drive home. "That's just Daddy," she said. Nate had nodded and let it go. He was good at letting things go. They married in June of 2017. Small ceremony, Portia's church, reception, at a rented hall in Noda. Bernard gave a toast that managed to compliment his daughter for 12 full sentences without mentioning his son-in-law once. Nate sat at the head table and smiled through all of it. By 2018, something had shifted in him. Quietly, the way things shift in men who spend a lot of time thinking and very little time talking. He had been coordinating other people's logistics for 6 years. He understood the inefficiencies in route optimization better than most of the engineers he worked alongside. He had ideas, real ones. He took a leave of absence from his job in March of that year and started building. Portia called it a phase. She said it gently at first. "I just hope you have a plan." And then less gently, "We can't live on ideas, Nate." And then, not gently at all. By the end of 2018, she had a word for it. Hobby. Said it the way people say a word when they want it to sting. "How's the hobby going?" He didn't argue with her. He just kept working. What Portia didn't know, what no one knew, was that in October of 2018, Nate had filed 3 software patents through a small intellectual property firm in uptown Charlotte. The filings were precise, thorough, and entirely in his name. He told no one. He paid the filing fees from a personal account Portia had no visibility into, an account he'd kept since before the marriage. He wasn't hiding it exactly. He just understood by then that some things grew better in the quiet. In 2020, Portia was promoted to vice president. The jump was real. Title, salary, office with a window. She celebrated at a dinner at her parents' house, and somewhere between the champagne and the dessert, she started using a new phrase. Breadwinner. She used it the way Bernard used builder, as a toast to herself, dressed up as a statement of fact. Nate ate his slice of pound cake and said congratulations and meant it. In 2021, Bernard called Nate into his home office during a Christmas visit and made him an offer. Junior analyst, Beaumont Financial Group. A desk, a salary, a title that would require Nate to sit 3 levels below men half his caliber. Bernard framed it as generosity. "I'm trying to help you get on your feet," he said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who expected gratitude. Nate declined. Politely, without explanation, the same way he did everything. Bernard never forgave him for it. By 2022, Portia had stopped wearing her wedding ring to work events. She mentioned it once, something about hand lotion, the ring slipping, and then never mentioned it again. Nate noticed. He didn't bring it up. Around the same time, Gloria began dropping a name into conversations the way you drop a coin into water, light and deliberate. Holden, old friend of Portia's, good family. Done very well for himself. Gloria never said more than that. She didn't need to. The marriage had become a quiet performance by then. They shared a house, shared a calendar, shared very little else. And through all of it, every dismissal, every toast that skipped over him, every dinner where he sat at the wrong end of the table, Nate kept working. His software had found its first commercial licensee in late 2022, a small regional carrier out of Greensboro, then a second. Then in 2023, Roadbridge Logistics, one of the largest regional freight operators in the Southeast, came to Eleanor Voss with a licensing inquiry that made her call Nate immediately. By 2023, Nate Greer had become a ghost in his own marriage, present, invisible, and building something no one in that house could see. What no one at that Thanksgiving table understood was what Nate had been quietly constructing during every single year they had spent dismissing him. While Bernard was collecting awards and Portia was collecting titles and Gloria was collecting reasons to mention Holden's name, Nate had been doing the one thing none of them had ever credited him with the patience to do. He had been waiting for the right moment. And that moment, it turned out, had been sitting in his jacket pocket the whole time. He was in Eleanor Voss's office by 9 o'clock the next morning. The Friday after Thanksgiving in Uptown Charlotte was quiet, in the way that only happens when the whole city has collectively agreed to stay home. The streets were half empty. The parking deck beneath Eleanor's building had more open spaces than Nate had ever seen. He took the elevator up to the 14th floor, gave his name to the receptionist, and sat down in the waiting area with the stillness of a man who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Eleanor came out herself to get him. She was a compact woman in her late 40s, dressed in a charcoal blazer even on a post-holiday Friday, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the measured calm of someone who had spent 20 years delivering information that changed people's lives and had learned exactly how to do it without drama. She shook Nate's hand, led him back to her office, and closed the door. She did not ask how his Thanksgiving was. She sat down across from him, opened a folder on her desk, and began. The 3 patents came first. She laid the filing documents out one by one. Patent numbers, filing dates, the precise technical language of each claim. October 2018, November 2018, February 2019. All 3 filed solely under the name Nathaniel Raymond Greer. All 3 predating the legal threshold for marital asset sharing under North Carolina law by a margin that Eleanor described, without editorializing, as clean. Then the money. The Roadbridge Logistics licensing agreement had been structured in tranches over 5 years. The first payment, $1.8 million, had cleared in early 2024. The second tranche, $4.7 million, was confirmed and ready for disbursement. Total contract value over the life of the agreement, $11.2 million. Nate had known the numbers. He had lived with them quietly for months, but hearing Eleanor say them aloud in sequence in a room with the door closed made them feel different, made them feel real in a new way. Then the Central South Freight Agreement, a separate deal structured independently, annual licensing fees of $2.1 million, renewable every 3 years, already renewed once. Nate sat with his hands folded in his lap and said nothing. Eleanor let the silence hold for a moment, the way good attorneys do, and then she reached for a second document. This one was different. It was a pitch deck, 42 pages professionally designed, the Beaumont Financial Group logo embossed on the cover page. Eleanor had obtained it through a routine due diligence request, the kind that gets made every day in financial circles without raising a single eyebrow. She slid it across the desk and let Nate open it himself. He turned to page 11. There it was, a section titled Technology Infrastructure, which described Beaumont Financial's freight sector client portfolio and attributed their exceptional performance metrics to what the deck called, and Nate read the phrase twice to make sure he had it right, advanced proprietary logistics intelligence integrated at the operational level, no source cited, no license holder named, no mention of a patent, no mention of a software developer, no mention of the man who had been sitting at Bernard Beaumont's Thanksgiving table for 7 years being treated like he had nothing to offer anyone. Eleanor explained it plainly. Bernard had structured his pitch to institutional investors around the performance of his 2 freight clients. He had pointed to their operational efficiency as evidence of Beaumont Financial's value add. He had implied, without ever saying it directly, that the technology driving that efficiency was somehow connected to his firm's proprietary advantage. The implication was false. The technology belonged to Nate. And if a compliance examiner were to look closely at the language in that deck, alongside the actual licensing agreements on file with both freight companies, the phrase material misrepresentation would not be difficult to arrive at. Nate closed the pitch deck and set it back on the desk. He looked at Eleanor for a long moment. "He's been selling my work," Nate said, without knowing it was mine. Eleanor nodded once. "That is an accurate summary." The irony of it sat in the room like something with weight. Bernard Beaumont, who had looked past Nate at every table, who had offered him a junior analyst position as charity, who had spent years treating his son-in-law like a man with nothing, had built the crown jewel of his investment portfolio on the foundation of that same man's mind. The freight companies that made Bernard's fund look brilliant. The technology that gave his pitch deck its best slide. The proprietary intelligence that had helped him raise $14 million from people who trusted his judgment. All of it traced back to a hobby with a laptop. Nate asked Eleanor to explain his options. She reached into the folder one more time and produced a single manila folder, thinner than the rest. She placed it in front of him without comment. Inside were 3 documents. Each one represented a different path. Each one had consequences she had already mapped out in the margins in her small, precise handwriting. Nate picked up the first page, read it, set it down, picked up the second, read it, set it down, picked up the third. He read it twice. Then he looked up at Eleanor and said, "This one." The slow burn was over. Option 3 was elegant in the way that only truly well-constructed plans are elegant. Not because it was complicated, but because it wasn't. Eleanor walked him through it at the same desk, the folder open between them, her reading glasses down from her head now and on her face where they belonged. The strategy had 3 simultaneous moving parts, and the beauty of it was that none of them required Nate to do anything loud. No confrontation, no accusation, no phone call where he lost his composure and gave anyone a reason to reframe him as the problem. Every single move would be made through proper legal channels in the correct order, with documentation that would hold up in any room in the state of North Carolina. Part 1. File for divorce. Immediately. That filing would trigger mandatory asset disclosure for both parties, which meant Portia's attorney would be legally required to account for everything, and so would Nate's. When Nate's disclosures surfaced the patents and their valuations, there would be nothing anyone could do about it. The numbers would simply be there, on the record in black and white, the way the truth tends to be when it finally runs out of places to hide. Part 2. Eleanor would send formal licensing audit notices to both Roadbridge Logistics and Central South Freight. The notices were standard compliance documents, the kind that arrived in legal departments every day and required a response within 21 days. The notices would require both companies to review any investor-facing materials in which their software sourcing was referenced and to ensure those materials accurately identified the license holder. It was procedural. It was airtight, and it would set a clock ticking inside Beaumont Financial Group's 2 most important client relationships without anyone being able to trace the trigger back to Nate directly. Part 3. Nate would retain a second attorney for the divorce proceedings alone. Eleanor recommended Marcus Webb of Webb Family Law, a man she described simply as someone who does not get rattled. Nate called Webb that same afternoon. Webb answered on the second ring, asked 3 precise questions, and told Nate he could have the filing ready by Monday morning. Nate said that would be fine. He deposited the $4.7 million check at First Meridian Bank on Saturday morning. The account had been open since 2015, 3 years before the marriage, 2 years before he ever met Portia Beaumont at a conference in a hotel ballroom downtown. It was a personal account, solely in his name, with a deposit history that predated every shared asset he and Portia had ever held. Eleanor had already confirmed what that meant legally. The money was untouchable. Saturday afternoon, Nate went back to the house. He had a key. It was still his name on the lease. He went in through the side door the same way he always did, moved through the kitchen without turning on the overhead light, and went upstairs. He took his clothes, his toiletries, the photograph of his mother that sat on the nightstand on his side of the bed. He took his laptop and the external hard drive that held 6 years of development files. He took nothing else. He was in and out in under 2 hours. He left no note. His phone rang twice that evening. Portia's name both times. He watched it ring, set it face down on the counter of the apartment he'd rented 3 weeks earlier in Plaza Midwood, and let it go to voicemail. He did not listen to the messages. He sent one text, 3 words, followed by 4. "My attorney will be in touch." He did not hear back. Sunday was quiet. He made a pot of coffee, opened his laptop, and worked. Not because he needed to. He had more money sitting in a bank account right now than most people saw in a lifetime, but because the work was what he did. It was what he had always done. The work was the thing they had never been able to take from him, even when they had tried their hardest to convince him it was worthless. By Sunday evening, Eleanor had confirmed the audit notices were drafted and ready to send first thing Monday morning. Marcus Webb confirmed the divorce filing would be submitted to the Mecklenburg County Courthouse when it opened. The $4.7 million deposit had cleared. Every document was in its correct place. Portia, as far as Nate could tell, still thought he needed a few days to cool off. She had called her mother that evening. He would find out later from a mutual friend who had heard it through the church grapevine that stretches across the west side of Charlotte like a second nervous system. Gloria had apparently said, with the serene confidence of a woman who had never once considered that she might be wrong about anything, that Nate would come back, that men like him always did, that they didn't have anywhere else to go. Nate sat in his new apartment, in the quiet, with his coffee and his laptop and his patience. The same patience he had been carrying for 8 years, like a jacket no one thought to check. The first domino was already falling. Portia just hadn't heard it yet. Day 3. Eleanor's audit notice arrived at Roadbridge Logistics headquarters on a Tuesday morning. It landed in the inbox of their general counsel the same way these things always do, quietly, formally, with the weight of a document that knows exactly what it is. By afternoon, Roadbridge's legal team had flagged it to their client liaison at Beaumont Financial. Just a routine mention on a routine call. Just a heads up that a licensing compliance review had been initiated on the route optimization software they'd been running for 18 months. Just a small thing. It wasn't small. Day 5. Bernard Beaumont received a call from the chief financial officer at Roadbridge at 11 in the morning. The CFO was polite, professional. He simply wanted to clarify something in the language of Beaumont Financial's investor fund deck, specifically the section describing the proprietary logistics intelligence driving client performance. He wanted to know the source of that technology. He wanted to know who held the license. Bernard had no answer. He told the CFO he would follow up. He hung up the phone and sat in his office on the 4th floor of the Beaumont Financial building in the leather chair he'd had for 20 years, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Bernard Beaumont did not know what to say. Day 7. A process server knocked on the door of the marital home in Dilworth at 9:45 in the morning. Portia answered it herself. She signed for the envelope without thinking. She thought it was a delivery. She opened it in the kitchen, standing over the counter still in her robe, and read the words at the top of the first page. She sat down on the kitchen floor. Her attorney got the call within the hour. And the moment the divorce filing triggered mandatory asset disclosure, the attorney did what divorce attorneys do. She started pulling records. Nate's records, looking for accounts, for assets, for anything worth fighting over. She found the patents within 48 hours, 3 of them. Filed in 2018, solely in the name of Nathaniel Raymond Greer. Valued, at current licensing revenue, at $11.2 million, every single dollar of it premarital. Portia's attorney called her with the news on day 8. Portia called Bernard immediately after. Bernard called Eleanor Voss's office at Voss & Kimball that same afternoon. Eleanor did not take the call. Day 10. A formal letter arrived at Beaumont Financial Group from the compliance officer at Central South Freight. It was 2 paragraphs, precise, unmistakable. Central South was removing all references to proprietary technology from their co-branded materials with Beaumont Financial, effective immediately, pending resolution of a licensing disclosure review. The letter did not explain further. It did not need to. Bernard read it twice. Then he called his own attorney. Day 12. 2 of Bernard's fund investors, men who had written checks of $2 million each into the Beaumont Financial Logistics Fund, requested emergency meetings. One of them sent a letter through his own legal counsel. The letter was 3 pages long. It questioned the accuracy of the fund's representations. It used the phrase reasonable basis for concern. It referenced the technology language in the pitch deck by page number. Page 11. The same page Nate had read in Eleanor's office 1 week earlier. Bernard's firm went into damage control. His team started making calls, sending emails, trying to get ahead of something that was already 3 steps ahead of them. They had no answers because they didn't understand the question yet. They didn't know where this had come from. They didn't know whose hands were on it. Nate, meanwhile, was in his apartment in Plaza Midwood, working, eating leftover rice and chicken he'd made Sunday night, watching the whole thing from a distance like a man who had set a clock and was simply waiting for the alarm. Day 14. Portia's attorney called Marcus Webb's office, seeking to negotiate. She came in with posture, confident language, implied leverage, the suggestion that there was room for a conversation about asset division. Webb let her finish. Then he placed 2 documents on the table, the prenuptial addendum Nate had signed in 2019 and the patent filing dates, all 3 patents, all 2018, all premarital, all Nate's. Portia's attorney asked for a recess. Webb told her to take all the time she needed. Day 17. Holden Price stopped returning Portia's calls. Quietly, without explanation, the way men like Holden always disappear when the math stops working in their favor. A mutual acquaintance would later mention, almost casually at a gathering in South Park, that Holden had actually approached Nate's LLC about an investment opportunity back in the spring of 2023, that he had sent a detailed proposal, that Nate's response had been polite, considered, and a single word, no. Day 21. A formal investor complaint was filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission against Beaumont Financial Group's logistics fund. The complaint cited material misrepresentation in offering documents. It named the fund by its registered designation, it named the firm, and it named Bernard Eugene Beaumont. Bernard Beaumont, who had called Nate the help at a dinner table in 2016, who had offered him a junior analyst position as charity, who had looked past him at every Thanksgiving like he was part of the furniture, who had never once in 7 years bothered to say his last name correctly. That name was now on a federal document. There was only one thing left. Nate arrived 7 minutes early. He wore the same jacket, the one from Thanksgiving. He had pressed it himself that morning, hung it on the back of a chair while he drank his coffee, and put it on the way a man puts on something That means something. Eleanor met him in the lobby of the Beaumont Financial Building, and they rode the elevator to the 4th floor together without speaking. There was nothing left to discuss. Every document was in the folder under Nate's arm. Every number was already on the record. All that remained was the room. Bernard's private conference room was exactly what you would expect from a man who had spent 30 years confusing success with superiority. Dark wood table, 12 chairs, framed commendations on the wall, a credenza with a crystal decanter that no one had touched. Bernard sat at the head of the table with his attorney beside him. Portia sat to his left, dressed like she was going to a board meeting, her posture rigid and her eyes red at the edges in a way that powder had not quite covered. Their attorneys had arranged this meeting under the expectation of a settlement negotiation. That was the framing Eleanor had used. Bernard believed he was walking into a room where he could still control the outcome. He opened with an offer. It was structured, rehearsed, wrapped in the language of reasonableness. He spoke about the complexity of the situation. He used the word misunderstanding 3 times. He suggested that with some goodwill on both sides, the matter of the fund representations could be resolved quietly without further regulatory involvement. He looked at Nate when he said it, directly, steadily, the way he had always looked at Nate when he wanted him to feel that compliance was the only sensible option. Nate waited for him to finish. Then he reached into the folder, removed a single document, and set it on the table in front of him without sliding it toward anyone. He did not respond to the offer. He simply began. In October of 2018, Nate said, his voice level and unhurried, I filed the first of 3 software patents through an intellectual property firm in Uptown Charlotte. The filing date is on record. The sole name on every document is mine. That was 6 years ago, 2 years before Portia's promotion, 3 years before you offered me a desk at this firm, and the same year my wife told her family I was playing with a laptop. No one spoke. Roadbridge Logistics entered into a licensing agreement for that software in 2023. Total contract value $11.2 million over 5 years. The second tranche, $4.7 million, cleared the week before Thanksgiving. He paused, not for effect. Just because the next part required precision. Central South Freight entered a separate agreement, $2.1 million annually, already renewed. Bernard's jaw tightened. Your fund deck, Nate continued, references advanced proprietary logistics intelligence as a driver of client performance. Page 11. I have it here. He did not open the folder. He did not need to. The technology described on that page is licensed from me. You have been presenting it to your investors as evidence of your firm's value add for 2 years. You did not know whose name was on the patent. You never asked. Portia made a sound, small, involuntary, like something had shifted suddenly under her feet. I sat at your Thanksgiving table for 7 years, Nate said. He was still not raising his voice. He had the quiet of a man who understood that the quieter he stayed, the louder every word became. 7 years of toasts that skipped over me. 7 years of being seated near the kitchen. 7 years of your daughter telling rooms full of people that I had nothing to show for myself. He looked at Portia then, directly, without anger, without cruelty. Just clarity. The year she called it a hobby with a laptop was the same year I filed the patent that your father's best clients have been running their operations on ever since. Portia's eyes filled. She pressed her hand flat on the table like she needed something solid beneath her. You spent 7 years telling me I had nothing to bring to this table, Nate said. But your investors have been buying into my work for 2 years. And not one person in this room, not one, ever knew my middle name?" The silence that followed was total. Bernard looked at his attorney. His attorney leaned in and said something low and urgent into his ear. Bernard's face, which had held its composure through force of lifelong habit, finally went still in a different way. Not the stillness of control, but the stillness of a man who has just understood the full shape of what has happened to him. Portia was crying quietly now. She did not try to stop it. Nate closed the folder. He stood. He buttoned his jacket, one button, the same way he always did, and picked up the folder from the table. He did not look at Bernard again. He did not look at Portia. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped through it without a word. Eleanor followed him out. Behind them, the conference room held its breath. No one in that room said anything for a very long time. The rest happened quickly. The rest, as promised, happened quickly. Bernard Beaumont's $14 million logistics fund was dissolved within 60 days of the SEC complaint being filed. Two of his institutional investors pursued civil action, filing suit against Beaumont Financial Group for material misrepresentation in offering documents. The firm's assets under management dropped by 60% in a single quarter, a collapse so swift and so complete that it made a brief item in a Charlotte business wire that people forwarded around without comment because the numbers spoke clearly enough on their own. Bernard did not fight it publicly. He announced his retirement in a 2-sentence statement released through the firm's communications office on a Tuesday morning in February. No farewell dinner, no tribute from the industry groups he had spent years cultivating. The firm was restructured under new management within the month, rebranded, and quietly distanced itself from everything the Beaumont name had meant. 30 years of building dismantled in one winter. Portia's divorce settlement was finalized in March. She received her premarital assets, her savings, her investment accounts, the things that had been hers before the marriage and remained hers after it. She received nothing from the patents. The valuations were clear, the filing dates were clear, and Marcus Webb had made certain that every document in the proceeding reflected both with the kind of precision that left no room for negotiation. Portia's attorney had tried, in the early weeks, to find an angle. There was none to find. Portia and Holden did not end up together. He had already moved on before the divorce was final, quietly, efficiently, the way Holden moved through everything. A mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing him at an event in Raleigh with someone new. Nobody was particularly surprised. Gloria gave an interview to a Charlotte lifestyle blog in April. The piece was titled Something About Resilience and Reinvention. She spoke in careful, polished sentences about family challenges and personal growth and the importance of maintaining grace under pressure. The comments were not kind. The blog quietly closed its comments section 2 days after publishing. Nate read none of it. He had work to do. In the spring, he established the Raymond Greer Technology Fellowship, named for a man who had believed in Nate's mind before Nate fully believed in it himself, a mentor from his early corporate years who had sat with him over coffee in a break room in 2017 and said quietly that the ideas Nate kept to himself were the most valuable things in the room. Raymond had passed away in 2021. He never knew what those ideas became. The fellowship was Nate's way of making sure that was the only thing Raymond missed. The first cohort was 12 students, all enrolled at HBCUs across the Southeast. Computer science, software engineering, systems design. The fellowship covered tuition supplements, equipment, and a mentorship stipend. Total first-year investment, $180,000. Nate announced it through a single press release and did not give interviews about it. A Charlotte Business Journal profiled him anyway in June. A reporter had followed the paper trail from the SEC complaint backward and arrived eventually at the patents and the licensing agreements and the quiet man at the center of all of it. The headline the journal ran was short. It called him the Quiet Architect. Nate read it once, folded the paper, and set it on his kitchen counter next to his coffee. That summer, his old friend Darius threw a cookout in his backyard off Beatty's Ford Road, the kind of afternoon that smelled like charcoal and cut grass and somebody's aunt's potato salad, with a Bluetooth speaker on the porch cycling through a playlist that kept making everyone stop their conversations to agree that yes, this was the song. Nate came with nothing but a bag of ice and arrived early enough to help set up the folding tables. That was where he met Diane. She was a civil engineer from Concord, a friend of Darius's wife, and she had the easy laugh of someone who had never needed a room to notice her. They talked for maybe 20 minutes about a bridge project she was working on, about the heat, about whether the potato salad had enough mustard, which it did not. She shook his hand when she left. Told him it was good to meet him, meant it in the uncomplicated way that people mean things when they have no agenda. Nate drove home that evening with the windows down. He thought about what patience actually costs. Not the dramatic kind of patience, not the patience of waiting for justice or waiting for recognition. The ordinary kind. The kind that asks you to keep working in a quiet room while the people around you decide what you are worth before you finish becoming it. That patience. The kind most people give up on before the story gets interesting. Some people will measure a man by what he carries in his hands, by his title, his salary, his seat at the table, the car in the driveway, the name on the door. They will take that inventory quickly and quietly, the way Bernard Beaumont took it the very first night he met Nate at his front door. And they will close the book before the last chapter. They never think to check the jacket. His name was Nathaniel Raymond Greer. Raymond, after the man who told him his ideas were worth something before he had a single dollar to prove it. He had been carrying that name his whole life.
Nobody had ever thought to ask. Now I want to know what you would have done.
If you had been sitting at that Thanksgiving table with a $4.7 million check in your jacket pocket while the people around you laughed, would you have shown it right then? Or would you have done what Nate did and waited until the moment was exactly right? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know where you stand. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it is the single best way to make sure more people find their way to stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We are just getting started. I will see you in the next one.